My hand was not on the trigger.
Convicted of murder.
I really feel like the jury should have known everything.
But it might not be case closed for Greg Lynn.
It was a nutcase.
What are the secrets hidden in his past?
It's his wife, treating her like an animal. What decent person does that to the mother of their children?
Hi there and welcome to the Extra Minutes podcast. I'm here with my colleague Anthony Dowsley, who is one of our fine producers. Welcome.
Thank you, Tara.
Now this story, terribly shocking,
Yeah.
really devastating, but also completely fascinating.
Yes.
Yeah. What do you think has fascinated most people when we talk about the high country story?
Well, it's a place where no one exactly knows where you are. You don't hear anything. It's a crime where you don't see anything. The only person who's left is someone who's not going to talk about it. And they're going to basically eliminate all traces that they were ever there. And that was what police had to find in this case, over 2 years finding him and 2 years getting it to court.
I know we're jumping around a bit, but he did talk. And that was the surprising thing, wasn't it? He actually took the stand.
He did. In the trial only last month, he made the extraordinary decision, the risky decision to get in the witness box and tell his story, a story that he'd given to police investigators 2 years earlier in an extraordinary record of interview where he first denied any involvement, would not make comment, and then changed his tack once evidence was put before him that he knew that he had to talk. He knew that they knew he'd been there.
You describe it as an extraordinary decision to take the stand. Why is that considered extraordinary?
It's always extraordinary because police and prosecutors in particular have to prove the case against any defendant. So until it's proven, you don't have to say a thing. And that's the safest position for anyone accused of a crime. In his case, he had the confidence, the cool-headedness and a calculated demeanour about him which by he felt confident that he could convince a jury that these were two accidents and that he was actually the victim.
So it was his own confidence? He wasn't cajoled into it by
I would
his
find that
counsel?
hard to believe, that it would have to be his instruction that he was prepared to take the witness box and deal with a prosecutor who was going to try and unravel him about all of the conduct over all of the years to hide his crime.
In such a high-risk stakes game, what does that tell you about his character?
Well, it really went back to his training. He was in the late 1980s and early 90s training to become an elite fighter pilot for the RAAF. He failed in that quest. He quit after failing a test and went on to become a commercial pilot after some times, and that's why we call him former Jetstar pilot. That was the last place he worked. But he worked all over. He worked overseas. He worked all over Australia. He had always had a good income, but he had a dark side going back to all those years ago.
Do you want to tell us about the dark side?
Well, when police were able to find that Greg Lynn had a link to Russell Hill and Carol Clay, the deceased in this case, they found that actually by three ways. That he had been in the area at that time, and they can prove that by he was snapped coming out of the area a day after the campers went missing at that point.
His number plate.
His number plate.
Mm-hmm.
They snapped his number plate near the area, and it was only by chance that they were able to do that because he had run into a gate which was closed and had to change his exit out of the bush.
The colour of the car became very important during the investigation, and we included that in a story on 60 Minutes.
Yeah.
What was the significance of that?
So when Greg Lynn looks across the horrific sight of two dead people that he's been camping alongside, he decides to don a pair of gloves just like this.
Like those?
Exactly like this, yep.
Why did he have those gloves?
He got them from one of the planes he was working on, and he took them up camping with him, and he decides to remove all evidence from a place called Bucks Camp, where he had been camping alongside Mrs. Clay and Mr. Hill. From there, he removes their bodies, he puts them in a trailer, he burns the scene, he eliminates all evidence that he was ever there, and he just moves out. And he basically had a plan. That plan didn't go quite right. He dumped the bodies, and then he says he just wanted to get on with his life. He returned there twice, and he burnt the bodies. And he described that as being despicable. But clearly he made up a story to remove himself from being a guilty party, being a murderer.
What did, we talked a bit earlier about going on the stand, which was an extraordinary decision. What did he actually reveal? What did he say had happened there?
Well, he said that Russell Hill was flying a drone, and that Hill had warned him that he had vision of him shooting too near the campsite, doing something illegal basically. And then they have a bit of a confrontation. Later on that night, he says, that is, Greg Lynn says that he saw Russell Hill take his gun from his car, and he chased him. They had a confrontation, and he alleged that Hill fired in the air, and leading for him to cower, and then have a struggle with him over the gun, in which Carol Clay was shot. And then he alleged that after that alleged accidental killing, Russell Hill attacked him with a knife and then fell on it. It's too extraordinary, it's far-fetched. 2 accidental deaths in the space of a minute or two, and that is something the jury couldn't believe.
Right. So so if you relate that then to the verdicts about what they could and couldn't believe, they couldn't believe it in the case of Carol Clay. They just didn't accept it, that she died as a result of a bullet that's ricocheted off a side mirror into her head. And there was a ballistic expert who said that just wasn't going to fly. So they say no, they don't believe him on that case. But what happens with Russell Hill?
Well, unfortunately, they couldn't really prove how he died. We've only got one survivor of the scene. And we don't know whether he was killed by a knife or by a bullet. We just don't know how he died. So you've got to prove intent, and you've got to pretty much know how they died, and the jury didn't have that. So they decided they couldn't convict him of that murder.
It almost sounds like a contradictory decision, doesn't it?
It does. It does.
They've found intent when it comes to Carol.
Yeah. They didn't believe his story. They did not believe Greg Lynn's story.
So does this mean they believed his story when it came to Russell Hill?
No. It just means that they didn't think they had enough proof to convict him of an intentional killing, a murder. That's all it means.
So he admits that he then collects the bodies, burns the campsite, attempts to leave the national park, locked gate. Must dump the bodies somewhere else then?
Yes.
Before leaving?
Yes, he goes to another site. He dumps the body, covers them up, drives away, and he then, about a month later, decides to change the colour of his car. He paints it from blue to beige and tries to continue on with his life.
And this is the role now of 60 Minutes. Has some role. 60 Minutes now has some role in this. Can you explain what our story was about at that time and why it was so important?
Well, as investigators would have known by the time our story came out, Greg Lynn was in the frame. He was the target. And to get him to talk more, his house had wiretaps. But they thought that by doing an investigation, 60 Minutes had approached them over time about this story. It came a time when they needed to talk, to get him talking. So they produced the vision of the car leaving the area, It's Greg Lynn's car. And as they knew, they watched 60 Minutes. That was something they knew from listening to them. And as his wife, Melanie, and Greg Lynn sits down to watch 60 Minutes that night, they see his story about the missing campers. And as they produce the picture of the car and a sketch of the car, Melanie says, "That looks like your car." And she's cackling and she's laughing.
This is Greg's wife.
This is Greg's wife. And Greg says, "That's not funny." And he goes on to change the car again. He takes an awning off, something off the roof of the car, and then just carries on.
So he tries to disguise his car
Yeah.
by painting it another colour. If the jury has judged that they can't believe his account of what happened, is there any idea of what happened, of what they do believe happened up there?
Well, all the prosecution could do, because there's only one storyteller, was to say, well, we think, our theory is that there is some form of a confrontation over this drone footage that allegedly was taken.
There's no drone has been found.
No, but Russell Hill definitely flew a drone.
Mm-hmm.
And that, you know, whether there is a struggle or not, they know that a gun has been fired. So they think that Russell Hill's been shot first or killed first, and Carol Clay has been killed because she's a witness. Mm-hmm. And they know she was shot because they found bone fragment up there at Bucks Camp.
For a cool-headed pilot, it was a pretty hot-headed thing to do, wasn't it, if this was all born out of a confrontation about a drone?
Yes, it goes to a trait that has been seen in his earlier years, that he's a hot-headed person, potentially a psychopath, that has had terrible history in his relationships. He terrified his first wife, who ended up dead in the front garden of their house in 1999.
Tell me about the circumstances around that. Was that a suspicious death?
Well, it wasn't deemed suspicious at the time. Lisa Lynn was a 34-year-old woman, mother of two. She had become estranged from Greg Lynn. He terrorised her, and she ended up, on the night of her death, she was found with alcohol in her system, 0.2, so a lot of alcohol, and sleeping pills. There'd been a lot of confrontations up to that point. Her two children were upstairs sleeping. Her car lights were on, and the keys were in the ignition. At the time, it was deemed not a suicide, but maybe misadventure or death by accident. But now there's an investigation into what happened. It's pretty extraordinary stuff, and it just wasn't checked. It wasn't checked enough by the police at the time.
So I think the inquest had an open finding.
Yeah.
Is there going to be another inquest, do you think?
Well, that's what the Victoria Police are hoping for, and that's probably the first of the priorities, is to potentially get another inquest into the death of Lisa Lynn.
And just describe their relationship. You said it wasn't happy, but what were some of the character traits that we saw in that relationship? How did he treat his wife?
Appallingly. We know that if something went wrong or if there's something displeased him, he'd react in a way that was abusive. We know that on one occasion, when she wasn't a drinker, she wasn't a big drinker anyway, she's a very light drinker, but she became intoxicated one night, and as punishment, he hog-tied her and took her outside of their Mount Macedon property, which is a part of Victoria which is very cold, just outside of Melbourne, and he poured water over her and left her outside for more than 20 minutes, so she would be freezing before she was allowed to go back into the house.
Did he have an explanation for that behaviour?
He said that on reflection it was bizarre. He'd been told it was bizarre, but he didn't really seem remorseful for it.
Why did he do it?
Well, he had a history of killing animals, being abusive to her, having affairs, and he was narcissistic because the only thing that really seemed to matter to him was his own career.
And controlling, I think, was another way, a describer of him, and perhaps that was what this, dousing her in water was all about, was he was trying to teach her a lesson.
Control's a good word, because that was something I noticed not only from the way he acted back then, but the way he acted in his police interview, where he's making sketches out about how he planned it all, that he, because of his training, he's cool in a crisis. And he goes through all of the different categorisations of what he should do, but also how it's going to affect him. And he writes it all out for them on a piece of paper. And that's the way he was controlling during his time in the testifying. He never lost his cool. He never came undone.
Right, but wasn't his defence, this terrible act of burning the campsite, burning the bodies, pulverising them, an act of panic? This cool-headed pilot panicked, he claimed.
Yeah, he said he panicked. But I think the reality is that he didn't, because he got so close to getting away with this. It's not funny.
You saw him at his trial. How would you describe his demeanour, the presence of this man?
He's unflappable. He was emotionless when he was in the dock. He was emotionless when he was told he was guilty of Carol Clay's murder. He stared straight ahead and he raised his eyebrows when someone looked at him, and that was about it.
Is cocky a word that you might describe? Like, did you get a feeling he thought he would get away with it?
I think he thought absolutely he was going to, because the evidence, because he destroyed it, was slim pickings against him. There's only his post-conduct, the moving of the bodies, the getting rid of the evidence, the idea that he panicked because of 2 accidental deaths. That's all there was. That's all they had, the jury had before them. But it was his gun, it was his clean-up, and it was his problem that he tried to erase for 18 months before he was caught.
Now, we're certainly not saying that he's responsible for this, but there have been other deaths of people who were part of his life at some point. Can you talk to me about the Zigzag Road neighbours? So,
the Geervin family, Sharp and Annie lived in Zigzag Road at around about the same time as the Lynn. They were friends with Lisa Lynn. And we don't know a lot about the relationship between Greg Lynn and the Vergeevens, but they died in a murder-suicide. Well, it's been deemed a murder-suicide. They were found in 2010, in March 2010, in their house. Their 3 dogs, which the couple had treated like children, had been shot. His wife, Annie, had been shot in her bed, and then he had shot himself, and he was found with the gun, with his hands wrapped around the gun. And the house was burned down as well, obviously before the shootings began. So that was just deemed a murder-suicide. They had some financial trouble, and that's it. Now, given the circumstances of what happened up in the Warrangata Valley and the burning and the staging, well, and then Lisa Lynn comes into the frame. Well, what happened to the neighbours just down the road in what no one could understand at the time, because Sharp and Annie were the happiest people in Mount Macedon. They were just a lovely couple who had done things that day, go to the naturopath, go swimming, cook dinner, take calls from friends. And then all of a sudden, their house is burning down and they're found all shot inside. It's strange.
And is that all we can say about it?
That's about all we can say about it, because we know that Greg Lynn had returned from overseas in 2007.
Yes.
And it does seem odd that by 2010 he's holding a grudge for that long, even if he did or didn't have a grudge. There's nothing to link him to it.
So it's just, at this point in time, pure coincidence.
But the gun that was used was... Sharp did not have a licence for a gun. He'd never been known to use guns, and the gun had no provenance. That's an issue.
That's an issue. And what has happened in life since then is the coincidence that
Yes,
connects
that's right. Yeah,
this man.
yeah. And then there's the car itself that Greg Lynn has owned since the late 1990s, which was bought as white. There's a trip around about 2006 to Central Australia. After that trip, it's changed to blue. And then after what happens in the Wollongata Valley in 2020, it's changed to beige or sandstone or something like that.
Or tan.
Or tan or something like that.
And we don't know why it was why he painted it.
The first time, we don't know. We just know he went away.
So there's more. There's going to be so much more on this story, isn't there?
Yeah, there is.
Are there any other tidbits that you have, Anthony, that you've kept from me?
That's pretty much it, I think. But it's such a complex investigation, and he's a complex man because he's so cool-headed as a pilot. I mean, I can't imagine the amount of people that have travelled on his planes over all these years for this narcissistic person that has this history. But I know that other pilots didn't feel comfortable flying with him, that, his traits, his character had always dogged him all of these years, and his reclusiveness to the bush was some form of, put it this way, his wife called him Captain, but others in the family called him Wolf Creek.
And is that because of his behaviour or because of how he looked?
Well, I think it might be his penchant for guns, which he had 7 of, his trips to the country by himself, and his demeanour.
And ask about how he looked because
there's a bit of a
likeness.
There's a bit of a likeness to Mick Taylor.
Mick Taylor.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you're right. I mean, it is such a horrific scenario. It's like he will be in the annals of our history, crime history now. So he's one of those kind of enduring, horrific monsters.
Yeah. And he's a horrific man that's still got the opportunity of appealing this case, which is, it was very evenly balanced. It was a fine-tuned case. Most people going into the verdict thought that he would be found not guilty because of the evidence that he destroyed. It couldn't be used against him, and it would have sent a message out that, to anybody who had ever committed a large crime like this, just erase the evidence.
Mm. What do you think will happen? Because there's the appeal process still. Do you think he'll stay behind bars?
Well, I think that this could go all the way to the High Court potentially because it's a split verdict. The problem is that the case was put that Carol Clay was killed because she was the witness, so she was the second person that was killed. When you can't prove what's happened in the first instance, how can you prove what's happened in the second instance? That's what probably the appeal will be about, because one led to the other.
Mm. It's a very fraught case.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your insights, though. It was terrific.
Thanks,
well
Tara.
done. And you can always watch our story on this case on YouTube or 9Now.